see so many of us from different book clubs come together for one. And joining us this evening is Margaret Coel, author of Chief Left Hand. Margaret is going to start with and give us a brief background on how she came to write the book, the research she did, the response she received, and then we'll switch to questions and answers. And with Margaret's permission, we're going to record the presentation and it will be available to our members in a few days. So with that, Margaret, if you would like to start telling us about your brief background.
The brief background. I'll tell you briefly about my background.
Briefly, good. Yeah, give us your story, Margaret.
Long background. Well, I'm a native Coloradan. I'm a fourth generation Coloradan, and that's how I became interested in the Native people. I'm always asked that. That's usually the first question. Well, why were you interested in the Arapahoes? And the answer is, I just was interested in the people who had lived here before my family came here. And I even as a kid, I wanted to know more about them, and I was always reading as much as I could about them. And I went on, I started out as a journalist, and then I switched over to freelance writing, and I was writing for magazines and newspapers. And I came across, in my reading about the Plains Indians, I came across this bizarre fact that just stopped me in my tracks. And it was that Niwot, Chief Left Hand, and by the way, Niwot, left hand is left hand means Niwot. Niwot is the Arapaho term for left hand. So I came across this fact that he was fluent in English. And I didn't know much, honestly, about the Plains Indians, but just what I had read generally. But I knew that they did not speak English. Each tribe had its own language. So the Arapaho spoke Arapaho, the Cheyenne spoke Cheyenne, the Lakotas spoke Sioux, the Apache spoke Apache, whatever. And so how did they communicate on the plains? They communicated with the sign language. So they developed a very elaborate sign language. And that's how they communicated with one another. And then as the white people, the traders and the trappers started coming out from the east and coming onto the plains, that's how they had to communicate with the tribes. They had to learn the sign language. So here is this man, this chief in the mid 1800s who's fluent in English. And I said, what? How did that happen? I think most of the time, articles for writers, the articles that they write, and even the books that we end up writing, come out of a question. It's something that we want answered. We want the answer to the question. And that sets us on a track that leads to whatever it is we write. So that was what set me on that track, was that question. How did he ever learn how to speak English and become fluent in it? So I thought this will make a great magazine. I was writing an article. I was writing for a lot of magazines at the time. This will make a great magazine article. So I set out to find out how he learned English and whatever. So I started reading more about him, and everything I read just repeated what I previously read. There was nothing new. I just kept reading the same old stuff over and over and over again. And so very quickly, I found myself going into the primary sources. So I started working at the libraries. I did a lot of work at the Denver Public Library Western History Department, at Norland Library, the Western History, at libraries. I ended up doing work in libraries all around this area, Nebraska, Oklahoma, the National Archives, the archives in Denver, the National Archives in Denver, and the University of Denver. I mean, on and on. And I just, as I say, I got into the primary sources, that is the records, the memoirs, the letters written by people who had known Left Hand, who had worked with him, who had been with him, and who had, personal knowledge of the type of man he was and of the things he did. So I was finding things that had never been published before, that nobody had ever looked at. It was there, but nobody had looked at it. And I remember one day I was in the Norland Library. And by the way, this whole project took me 5 years. So it was a long project. And but I remember sitting in the Norland Library and I had been reading treaties. Now, if you want some really exciting reading, I suggest the old treaties between the Plains Indians and the government. So I've been reading through those, and it just hit me. It just hit me. I thought, you know, this is not an article. This is a book. So I've always thought, I did not set out to write a book at the time. I was pretty busy with what I was doing. And plus I had 3 fairly young children. So, I mean, I wasn't looking for a book. And yet I realized that I had uncovered all this information and that had never been published before. And I just hit me, I've got a book here. So I've always felt that I didn't look for a book to write, but a book looked for me to write it. And so that was how I decided, okay, I got a book, and I started working on it. Now, the thing was, I couldn't write the ending because the ending was very controversial. Scholars who had written about the subject, since 1864, which was the date of Sand Creek, had argued over what had happened to him at Sand Creek, at the massacre at Sand Creek, and whether he had survived or whether he had been killed. And it was like they were divided. Half of them said, oh, yeah, he survived. He was wounded. He laid low for a while. He recuperated. And then he came back and he led his tribe again in Oklahoma. After Sand Creek, the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes they had been driven out of Colorado. And many of them went to Oklahoma. And sure enough, about 10 years after Sand Creek, here is a man in Oklahoma who becomes a very well-regarded, very astute leader of the Arapahoes, and his name was Chief Left Hand. So the scholars who said he survived, they said, oh yeah, and then he resumed his rightful place of leadership in Oklahoma. It's the same man. The other half said, no, he died there. He was killed at Sand Creek. Well, I couldn't finish the book because what was it? I could write 2 endings. So that wasn't going to work. So I kept looking, kept researching, and just feeling more and more frustrated. And then it hit me that there was a book that was written by a historian by the name of George Hyde. And he wrote a biography of George Bent. George Bent's father had founded Bent's Fort. His name was William Bent. And he had founded Bent's Fort down on the Arkansas River, down near La Junta. If you haven't ever visited it, I recommend take a trip down there. It is so interesting. It's so worth seeing. The fort has been totally restored, and it will take you back in time into the mid 1800s. I mean, it's just a wonderful place. But anyway, George Bent was a half-breed. His father was William Bent, and his mother was a Cheyenne woman. So he moved back and forth between those 2 cultures. His father had sent him to St. Louis to be educated so he could read and write, and he was a very smart man. So at the time that George Hyde was writing his biography, George Bent was living in Oklahoma. And it was probably around the 1880s. And George Hyde was corresponding with Bent. And Bent would send him letters, copious letters about his life and all the things that had happened. And then Hyde wrote this wonderful biography. And in the biography, there's a lot about Sand Creek because George Bent had been at Sand Creek. So he wrote a lot about it. And I got to thinking, there was nothing in the book about what had happened to Chief Left Hand at Sand Creek. But it struck me that maybe there was something in the original manuscript that Hyde had written, because editors, by that time I knew, editors had a way of just, taking out things that they didn't think were germane or whatever. And I thought, I decided I needed to get a hold of that manuscript. So that sent me on another whole detective, looking for the manuscript hunt. And I discovered that Hyde had put his manuscript at the Denver Public Library in the Western History Department. So I took myself down there. Sure enough, they had the manuscript. They pulled it out for me. It was buried way in the archives, and they pulled it out, and I went through the manuscript, found the place on Sand Creek, and it was just the same as in the book. So there wasn't anything different. But I kept looking through the manuscript, and tucked in the pages of this manuscript were 2 letters written by George Bent to George Hyde. And one of them said, Chief Left Hand, the Arapaho Chief Left Hand was killed at Sand Creek. And the other one said, the left hand who is here in Oklahoma is no relation to Chief Left Hand killed at Sand Creek. George Bent had known Left Hand all his life, and he had been at Sand Creek, so he knew exactly what had happened. So I had my ending, and I was very sad. I remember sitting there in the library and feeling that I just got news, that a dear friend, a relative, someone close to me had been killed, when I'd been hoping all along that he had survived and that he had gone on to Oklahoma. But no, in fact, he had been killed. So I was able to finish the book. Since then, there have been numerous other letters that scholars have uncovered written by George Bent about the Sand Creek Massacre, and they all confirm that Left Hand was indeed killed there. And then there are other there are other primary sources that have surfaced as well, other letters written by people who had been at Sand Creek that confirm what had happened there. So we know that is what happened. So as I say, I was able then to finish the book. So I wrote the book. I had been consumed with this project for 5 years. I was absolutely, I mean, consumed is the only word I can say. I had no idea if I could get it published. I had no idea if anybody would ever want to read it. And, I just didn't know. And you know what? I didn't care. I was going to write that book no matter what. I was just obsessed with it. And so I did write the book. All the time I was doing the research, I kept keeping track of publishers that might be interested in it. And among them was Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma, because they published so many wonderful books on the West and many on the American Indians. So I got the book finished and sent off the manuscript to Oklahoma with a lot of hope and wondering what would happen. And sure enough, they accepted it. So that was a very happy day. The day I got the phone call from the University of Oklahoma Press saying, the editor said, Margaret, I've read your book. I really love it. And I want to publish it. I said, okay, then that's really good. I had sent it off to several other publishers at the same time. And three of them came back and said they wanted to publish it. So that was all really pretty exciting. So that's how the book was published. It was published in 1981. It's never gone out of print. It still is pretty widely read. It's read in schools and classrooms and in groups like the AAUW. And so it's been really, I could never have imagined, that it would still, after all these years, 41 years, that it would still be read. So it's very gratifying to know that, and it makes me happy. So that's the story of how I came to write it and what happened with the writing. It was reviewed all over the world. It was reviewed by many, many publications. It was reviewed in Israel, in many different countries. It was just kind of amazing. It just came out of the chute, like this obscure Arapaho chief that very few people had ever heard of. And all of a sudden he's, the reviews of the book are appearing all over the world, and the book started selling all over the world. So as I say, it's been very gratifying. It also gave me an entree to the Arapaho world and led to my whole career. When I was researching Chief Left Hand, I started going to the Wind River Reservation where the Arapahoes live today. That's their reservation. There's still many Arapahoes who live in Oklahoma, and many Arapahoes who live here. We have quite a number of Arapahoes who live in the Boulder, Denver area. So, but their homelands now are on the Wind River Reservation with the Shoshones. They share that reservation with the Shoshones. And this is, one of the ironic and sad things that happened. After they were run out of Colorado, they had no place to go. They were being harassed across the plains. It's a very sad story. And the government had already given this Wind River Reservation area to the Shoshones. And so at some point, the government finally said to the Arapahoes, oh, just go up there and live with the Shoshones. They were traditional enemies. And my friends, my Arapaho friends, they really believe that the government was hoping they would kill each other off. And then that would be the end of the two tribes, you know. And also, when they discovered oil and gas on the reservation, you know, then there were all, that's a whole other story. I could write another book about that, but you know, then there were all other efforts to wrest that land from them so that they could take over all the natural resources. But that's the story of the book. And as I say, it's still being read. I'm grateful for that. At some point, just when we were getting ready to publish it, Oklahoma was getting ready to publish it, my husband and I talked about it, and we thought, well, you know, it's going to be a university book. It's about a Plains Indian chief. It's probably not going to be a bestseller. So we decided we would give the book to our children. So we did. We gave it to the children. So it's their book. So they collect the royalties on it every year. And they're wondering why I didn't give them all the rest of my books. You know, they would like that, but they would like them too. But as I say, it gave me an entree to the reservation. I started going up there. I got to know the people. And then eventually I started writing mystery novels that are set on the reservation. And I ended up writing 22 of them. And my husband and I spent many, many wonderful, wonderful weeks and even months on the reservation over the years, made many wonderful friends up there. So this book, Chief Left Hand, and this question, how did this man learn to speak English? That one question set me on a whole career path that I never could have imagined. So let me answer that question for you. And in case any of you haven't read the book, he did learn to speak English because his sister, Mayham was her name, married a white trader, John Poisal, who was working at Bent's Fort. And John Poisal took Left Hand and his brother, Neva, under his arm and taught them both to speak English. And Left Hand became fluent in English. So that made him a very valuable person, given what was going on at the time on the plains with all the changes that were taking place. You know, we think we have a lot of you know, population changing here and growing, and it is in Boulder County and through this whole area. But imagine what happened to them, to the Indians in 1864, or before the 1858, when gold was discovered in Colorado. You know, the first fall, the fall of 1858, there was something like, oh, I don't know, I've forgotten the numbers, but something like 30,000 white people who came here, 30,000. The next spring, which is called the Real Gold Rush, which is 1859, there were 150,000 people who came out here. The Cheyennes and Arapahoes together probably only numbered maybe 10 or 12,000 people. So just imagine, they were just overrun. You know, it was just amazing what happened. So it was a very tumultuous time, a dangerous time, and a very difficult time. So the man who could speak English, who could go and talk to these white people and these white leaders, he was very valued and very important man. And so that's what he did. He played a very, very important role here. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the book and about the aftermath. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hold on. Where am I?
I see you.
Oh, there I am. Okay. Why don't you, we didn't really talk about how we're going to do that. We're a small enough group. Why don't you raise your hands and I'll call on you and then you can ask your questions. Okay, Wanda.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I was reading something and I can't remember if I read it or I heard it somewhere. And you talk about the peace chiefs and how Left Hand was one of those. And so can you give us some more information about these chiefs and what their role was within the Plains Indian community?
Sure. the Peace Chiefs, and yes, he was one of them. And Black Kettle with the Cheyennes, and White Antelope, his brother, was another one. And these were men who, they were realists. They realized that all of these white people coming onto the plains and, you know, just taking over their lands, there were so many of them. As I said, you know, there are more of them than there are leaves on the trees. They're like the stars in the heaven. There are so numerous, and they just keep coming, keep coming. And what's more, they had guns, and they had ammunition, and they manufactured those things. Whereas the Plains Indians, in order to get weapons, they had to trade for them. Other than that, they had bows and arrows and hatchets. So these peace chiefs were realistic people who realized their way of life was going to be destroyed, because as all these white people came on the plains, they were destroying the buffalo. And of course, the Plains Indians lived off the buffalo. And so they were killing the herds and dispersing them. And the warriors, you know, they talk, there are sections in the book where they talk about how they had to ride so far to find herds in order to get enough meat to feed their people. So it's very, very difficult time. So this peace chief said, we have to find a way to work with these people. We have to find a compromise. We have to find some way that we could both live here. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to find a way where they could have what they called reserved lands. And that's where the term reservation comes from. There would be reserved lands that would be their lands that these white newcomers would stay away from, and they could live on their lands. And that was their hope. And, you know, it didn't happen. They did get reservations eventually, but they were herded onto the reservations. And then it didn't turn out the way the peace chiefs had hoped that it would. And the other problem that happened with the peace chiefs was the young warriors often rebelled against them. And that happened with Left Hand too, because, you know, they're young, they're 18, 19 years old, they're warriors, and they're like, let's go out and get these guys. You know, we don't have to put up with this. And they weren't willing to, you know, sit back and take the advice of the peace chiefs and try to work out some way, some compromise, some way they could continue to live here on the plains. So these peace chiefs were stuck between, you know, trying to work out the whites, trying to work out something with the whites, and trying to keep their own warriors down. Because while they're trying to make peace with the whites and negotiate and come up with treaties and so forth, their warriors were out attacking white ranches and killing the whites. So they were in a really tough situation. So those were the peace chiefs.
Okay, Kathy, you had your hand up.
Yes, I did. You talked about the fact that you'd spent a lot of time on the Wind River Reservation, and you've now written books that relate to those people. How were you received? And has that changed over the years from the first you went researching to then publishing books about them?
Always been received so well there. The Arapahoes are very friendly people, and even, you know, in the old time, which is how they refer to it, but when they were on the plains, as they say, when we lived free on the plains, they were known to be very friendly. They were friendly to the white people who came out here. They were traders. And traders have to go around and meet people and deal with people. And they were traders. They were the consummate traders. So they were the means through which goods were exchanged all across the plains. So they were very friendly. So they were very friendly to me. They were always friendly to me. When I first went up there, another writer, her name was Virginia Coel Trenholm, no relation to me, and she had written a book called The Arapahoes Are People. And she was fairly elderly at the time. And I contacted her. She lived in Cheyenne. And while I was researching Chief Left Hand, I contacted her and asked if I could come up and meet with her. And I had some questions I wanted to ask her, you know, about the research I was doing. And so we just kind of hit it off. We became friends. And she said to me, would you like to go to the reservation? And I said, yeah. And so we made arrangements, and she took me to the reservation the first time I went. And that was a huge thing because they loved her. She had spent a lot of time up there. She's probably in her 70s, so she wasn't that old, but she had white hair. And so they just adored her because she had white hair. and they trusted her. So for her to bring me in and introduce me to her friends was huge. It was just huge. So that gave me a real entree into the reservation. And every time that we went up subsequently, everybody was just lovely to us and friendly and welcoming. And then after I started writing the novels, and I would go up to the reservation, and even when several novels had come out, and I would meet someone new, and that person would say, I had this happen a number of times, it would say, oh, Margaret Coel, Chief Left Hand. So they had read Chief Left Hand, so they didn't even know I was writing these other novels, but they knew Chief Left Hand. And they really liked that book. And so after it came out, before it came out, they accepted me because Virginia had introduced me. But after it came out, they really liked the book. And so then they accepted me because I had written that book. So I was fortunate. We had just wonderful experiences on the reservation with the people and got to know so many of them. So it was great. And how did it change? It didn't really change on the reservation. They've always were welcoming to us. What began to change is the political correctness coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, what? You're not Arapaho? How come you can write about the Arapahos? The Arapahos never said anything like that to me ever, So, but that began to change. And so I began to getting those questions when I go out and speak. Well, how can you write about when I'm blah, blah, blah. And I always would say, well, you know what? That's what writers do. That's what we do. We imagine other people. We imagine what it's like. We do our research. And I was writing history. So, for Left Hand, I had to do a lot of research. But even in my novels, I did a lot of research for each one of my novels. I did my work. And I went and I talked to people, and I talked to all the experts and people on the reservation who knew about what I was writing about and got their input and all that kind of thing. I did my work. And then as a fiction writer, you have to imagine, you use your imagination. You imagine, what would this be like to live on the reservation? What would it be like to be an Arapaho woman? I'm not an Arapaho woman. Or what would it be like to be a man? I'm not a man, but you imagine that. And that's what writers do. And I think if we ever reach a point where we tell writers that they can't do that, then we're done. Literature is over. Because that's what writers do. So
Thank you.
Sure.
Darcy, and then Lindy will get you.
Hi, this is Darcy, and I'm standing outside a bar in Delta, Colorado, where they're watching the Broncos game, and I have put my questions in chat. So, Bev, if you would read my questions out of chat,
I'll be happy.
mute myself.
Okay, there are two parts. What can you tell us about the huge series of research at the university that this is part of? It looks like 250 years of papers. And the second part is, do you think the acknowledgements of original ownership of tribal land that are now common are useful or not? Darcy, does that capture what you were asking?
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
I'm not clear on the first question. Could you repeat that?
Oh,
Sure.
well, let's see. The question was, it should have been 150 years. Your book is part of a collection at University of Oklahoma. Is that right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered, what's the history of that collection? It looked like it starts way back and comes to the present. And is it still going on?
Yes, as far as I know, Oklahoma decided at some point, and it's been quite a few years, I can't tell you how many, but they decided to specialize in literature on the Plains Indians, the American Indian, not just the Plains, but the American Indian. And so they set up this series of books called The Civilization of the American Indian series. And when they accepted my book, they made it part of that series. So that was lovely, because libraries and all who want to have the full series will buy the new books that are brought into that series. So Oklahoma is known for just publishing wonderful books on the American Indian. That's really their specialty. So a lot of the books written by American Indians. So and the history, and even the literature, and even not just nonfiction, but fiction as well now. So that's the first. Now, what was the second one?
It is. Do you think the acknowledgements of original ownership of tribal land that are now common are useful or not?
I think it's useful to know our past. I think it's useful to know our past. I wish that the Broncos must have made a touchdown, did they? I think we should all know our history. So in that sense, yeah, I think it is useful. We should know that the lands where we live, right here in Boulder and in Longmont, once belonged to the Arapaho people. When I drive out across the plains and I see these wonderful cottonwood stands along the creeks, and I think, oh, that's where they camped. That's where the Arapahoes camped. They camped in those places, in the shades of the cottonwoods along the creeks. And I think, oh, the Arapahoes are here. So, I think it's useful to know that. What can we do about it? Actually, the government did pay the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes a large amount of money for their lands. Of course, it's nothing compared to what these lands are worth, because their lands went from the Continental Divide to central Kansas, and from the Platte River in the north to the Arkansas River in the south. So that's an enormous area. And that was the land that by treaty, the government had recognized as Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. And then they were driven off those lands and put on reservations. But as I say, later on, up until the last payment, I think, was made in the 1950s, the government did try to recompense them for their lands. So.
Okay, Lindy, you had a question?
Yes, Margaret, this has to do with the craft of writing. You were writing about a very violent times, and a lot of horrendous things happened at that point. How do you decide how to portray that? And when you think that fine line of when a reader can't take it anymore, because it was such a horrible period in our history with such violence, especially violence towards women. Just wanted to know your thought as a writer on that.
It's hard. It was hard. And let me tell you, I have a daughter, one of my daughters, who has never read this book. She just can't read it. It's just so hard. She knows the story because we used to talk about it when I was writing it and all, but she said, I just can't read that, Mom. It's just too hard. How did I try to portray it? I just tried to portray it as it happened. These are the facts, and the facts are hard. I mean, to write about Sand Creek, which, I just started, this is what happened, and just try to tell it like it happened. But I want to tell you, it was really hard. And there were times when I was crying while I was writing. But then, I heard a writer say once that, well, no tears in the author, no tears in the reader. So I guess it's good if the author cries. So I was very affected by it. It's hard. It takes a lot out of you. It really does. But I just tried to tell the story. Just this is what happened. This is what happened. It's a tough story, and it's the people were so so caught up in it. There wasn't anything they could do. They couldn't help themselves. They hoped that they could make some changes, but they weren't able to. And they're not from the beginning, because how it ends. So they weren't able. And to see them struggling and trying to negotiate and believing, what the white leaders were telling them. And all that, and to see that happening, and how it's going to end. And it's tough. It's really tough. It takes a lot out of you as a writer.
Well, it was very authentic the way you wrote it, and hard to read at times, but I appreciate your honesty as you wrote it. Yeah.
Thank you. There were times when I'd be writing in my little study here, and I'm alone all day in the house when that was before my husband retired, and the kids were at school and all that. And I'm writing away, and I'm in this really, intense moment that I'm writing about. And sometimes I would just get this eerie feeling, that I wasn't really alone, that maybe somebody else was in the room. It was a strange feeling. I don't tell too many people that. People think, I wonder what she was sipping on while she was writing that book. But it's a very emotional, intense. It's intense.
Okay, and Linda had a question.
Thank you. I appreciated how you wove in some of the Colorado history and I was curious why we didn't become a state before 1876, because you presented that there were multiple attempts, but then once we did become a state, were the Indians driven off the land completely then?
They were really driven off the land after Sand Creek, 1864. Sand Creek was the last. And from then on, they were just being driven off the lands, with the exception of the Utes. But they were gradually driven onto reservations in the mountains. But the Cheyennes and Arapahoes and they fled Colorado too. After Sand Creek, they were so demoralized, and so many of their family members were dead, and they were just devastated. And so they left Colorado. So what the government did, and this was right after Sand Creek, 1865 and 1866, and treaties that were held then, they divided the tribes, and they put half of them on reservations in Oklahoma and half on reservations in the north. And for a while, they didn't have a reservation for the Arapahoes. As I said, it wasn't until 1878, I think, that they told the Arapahoes to go and live with the Shoshones on the Wind River Reservation. And they put the Cheyennes, the Northern Cheyennes, on a reservation in Montana. So they divided the tribes. The tribes in Oklahoma then, in about 1890, sold their reservations back to the government. And that was when Oklahoma was settled. And, the day that was finalized, that the tribes had sold their lands back to the government, and the government threw the lands open then to homesteaders. And, they're called the Oklahoma Sooners. That's because the sooner they got there, and the sooner they, got to the good lands, the sooner they could get their hands on the good lands. And that's why they're called the Sooners. So that's what happened to them in Oklahoma. They lost their lands. Many of them still live there, but the Arapahoes and the Cheyennes in the north have held on to their reservations. So with the Wind River Reservation, it's become like the home center for the Arapahoes. So they have the Sundance every year, every July, and that's their major spiritual ceremony. It's lasts for almost a week, and it's a very, very devout and wonderful, wonderful event. And Arapahoes come from all over. They come up from Oklahoma, driving their trucks up along I-25, just like they used to ride their horses back and forth. Now they, come ride. I-25, by the way, is based on old Indian trails. So they drive up from Oklahoma to go to the Sundance. So the Wind River Reservation is now, their homelands. It's the center. It's where their holy people live. It's where their spiritual ceremonies take place, the Sundance and others. So it's where they go.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question. I was amazed at the number of times the tribe would have gone out, away from the Boulder area, and somebody would go over to see them. And it just sounded like they knew where to find them exactly out there on the plains. And when you drive out there on the plains,
Yeah.
I mean, I assume they probably followed rivers, but they, you know, if they went a mile north or south, you wouldn't see them from those places. You know, that just was a puzzlement to me.
Are you talking about like the soldiers, would they would go out on the plains and they would find them?
Well, really anybody, you know, like if Left Hand wanted to go see another tribe or
Oh.
pass some information on, how would he find exactly where they were?
Well, I think a lot of the times, you know, they would camp in the same places. They knew
Okay.
they had areas that they liked to go to. And so the Cheyennes would go to certain areas and the Arapahoes as well. There's an area up by Fort Morgan that was very popular. I write about it in the book and I can't think of the name of it. But there were just areas that were very popular and that they would go to the same campsites year after year. They would go out onto the plains looking for the buffalo. And they would go out in the spring, summer, and fall. They'd be out on the plains hunting. Then they would come in, and especially the Arapahoes, and live here close to the mountains because it was milder than being out on the plains in the winter. So, but I think that's, and certainly the soldiers, once they were out and about, they were patrolling everywhere. So they knew where the tribes were. They knew where they could locate them, you know, and they knew where they were camping, you know. But other than that, I think they knew how to find one another. And there were runners going back and forth all the time and communicating, you know, keeping communication open and going. So they would come in and they would let the chiefs know, you know, where some other chief is camped, you know, for the winter. So I think it's amazing. I was amazed when I found out, the more I got into it, how much communication there was going on across the plains. Because as you say, it's such a huge, pretty desolate area. And yet they know where one another, they know where to go. They know who was over here and who was over there. And the other thing that was amazing was the amount of trade that went on. And the Arapahoes, being traders, they knew where everybody was because they were visiting all the other camps and trading. And they traded, they had items that came up from South America and Mexico and came up in here into the plains from Europe and from Canada, which we know that they had those items because, you know, they've been located and there's evidence that they were trading. So there was an immense amount of trade going on. More than you think. You think they're just isolated out here on the plains, but they weren't. They were connected with one another and then with the outside world through their trade.
Okay, Nancy Holt. Nancy, you're muted. You need to.
Sorry, didn't notice that. This is a sort of a linguistic question, I guess. I am left-handed and I live on Arapaho Drive, so I have particular interest in Chief Niwot. But our street name has an E at the end. And one place in your book, I saw the name mentioned with the E, but everything else was O. So is the E anglicized?
Yeah, yes, absolutely, it was. And probably if it's mentioned in my book with an E, it probably was referring to the anglicized version, or quoting it or something like that. They do not have an E on it.
Okay.
So that was anglicized. Yeah.
That was my question. And then the other comment, I was, well, my husband, like you, is a fourth generation Colorado, and we lived in Denver for several years. I was amazed at the number of streets in Denver that I had no idea what the individual was. And you've talked about land acknowledgements. I don't know if you have a particular opinion about the movements now to change names. Recently, Evans, in Denver, there's a movement to change the mountain's name. Longmont years ago in '77, I think they changed the name, but Shibington was a street name.
Oh, I know.
It took them 10 years to change that, but they did.
They did.
Do you have any opinion about that?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think that I don't think they should be erased from history. We don't
Right.
need to erase them. We should know who they were and what they did.
Mhm.
But I don't think they should be honored.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
Evans, Evans was
Mm.
just a despicable man.
Yeah.
And the way he treated the tribes and what he did with the tribes was terrible. He was really behind Sand Creek,
Mhm.
and Chivington was his, his go-to guy who did the dirty work. But Evans was behind the whole plan. So yeah, I hope they do change the name of Mount Evans, and I'm glad they changed the street in Longmont. And I don't know if they changed the name of the town. There's a town right outside
Yes, right.
the creek
I don't know.
named Chivington.
Mhm.
So I don't know if they've changed that. It's really not a town anymore. It's just like barely a crossroads, a dirt roads. But yeah, I don't think they should be honored.
Thank you. I agree.
And Charlotte, you had a question?
No, it was actually just what Nancy asked about Chillington Drive and Mount Heaven. So, yeah.
Okay. And Sherry? And you are muted, Sherry.
Okay, you were in charge of that. I was trying the other button. Just a comment that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, I believe there was a part of your book that mentioned when the tribes were sort of being encouraged, shall I say, to try agriculture and farming, et cetera, and Chief Left Hand actually traveled through Nebraska to Iowa to research how things were done there. Is that correct? And obviously came to the conclusion that this would not ever be something that would work for his people. Did I state that correctly?
Yes, you did. Yeah, there was a manuscript that I found at the Denver Public Library written by, his name was Marshall, and he is the man who on the way back had encountered Left Hand, and Left Hand was coming back from his trip to Iowa. And then he wrote about it, how he had gone there to, because he talked to him, because of course Left Hand was fluent in English, and he wasn't shy about talking to white people. He had friends here in Boulder Valley, around the Niwot area. He would come up and stay with them on their ranch, and talk to them about the problems and things that were going on and all. So he spoke with Marshall and told him what he had done and that he had gone back to Iowa and so forth. And when I found this manuscript, it was just seemed so unbelievable. I thought, really, could that really have happened? But then I did more research, and I found that I didn't find anything that agreed with that, or that other evidence as to that. But I did find other scholars who had grappled with it too and decided that it was true. So and I put a note in my book as to that effect.
Okay.
That, and I can't remember the name of the scholar, but that it was accepted by other people. It certainly would be an outrageous thing for probably any other Indian chief to have done, or Indian man at the time. But a man like Left Hand, who was fluent in English, who had grown up with white people, who had friends among white people, he is the only man, I think, who could have done something like that. So, and I think he would have wanted to know if his people could switch over to farming, because they kept hearing about how the white people could get their food out of the ground. And they thought that was pretty amazing. How do you do that? Of course, they got food out of the ground too, but they didn't cultivate it. But they certainly lived on wild vegetables that grew, the wild fruits and all, and the berries and all that kind of thing. They made use of all of those. But to cultivate it, that was something different. And so I think he is, I think he's the one man that could have done that. And maybe there'll be some evidence, when you write history, there's always more evidence that comes up that somebody finds, that will disprove that. But so far, nothing has surfaced that does. So I think it's definitely a very strong possibility.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to tell everyone that Linda Davies found the Loveland Museum is having a program, and Linda alerted it to us. And the title of the program is The Days After Colorado's Darkest Day, the Julesburg Campaigns of 1865. And it's a Fort Collins historian is going to talk about what happened after the Sand Creek Massacre. So we'll be putting some more information out about that. A couple of us are interested in going to that, and we'll let everybody know so that if more of you are interested, we can carpool or something. I think it's a very timely presentation, and I think it will add to the book that we read.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, I would think. And I do talk about what happened. I mean, the tribes rose up in rebellion, and there was a bloodbath, and and all along the Oregon Trail, and they cut off Julesburg, and yeah, there was a lot that went on. So that would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. So keep your eyes. Okay, Nancy has a question. And we need to have you unmute. I could.
You'd think I'd learn. Slow learner. In all the letters and things, the president is referred to as the Great White Father. Was that again the terms that the government used, or do you know if that was the term that the Arapahoes used? It wasn't leader, it wasn't Great White Chief, it was Great White Father.
Yeah, that was the term they came up with.
The Arapahoes did.
And the other Plains Indians. Yeah, they always just called him the Great White Father.
Father, okay.
Father being the head of everything. And the Great White Chief in a way, but they call him a father because the father has a care for his family and for his children. And there's some touching, moments where they talk about that, where they ask him, they ask that the Great White Father take pity on his children out here on the plains, and what's happening to them. So, but that wasn't, I don't think any of the presidents gave themselves that term. But, so that definitely came from them.
Thank you.
So do we have, okay, Wanda has a question. And Wanda, you're muted.
I'm sorry. This habit, it's not there yet. I've read a lot of the Wind River. I want to make a little change of tone here. The Wind River Reservation mysteries as well. And I'm just so always impressed with the description you have of the ceremonies. And I know that has to come from your connection with the population there on the reservation. But could you tell us more about what it's like to be there, to visit, to engage with these people?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It's lovely. We've been to the Sundance a number of times, and that's their most sacred ceremony. And there are many things, there's rituals that take place during it. It goes for quite a while because there are several days of preparation, and then there are like 4 days of the Sundance. And they camp on the Sundance grounds in their teepees. So when you go there, there's a lookout that you can drive onto the top of the lookout and look down over this camp, and there'll be several thousand Arapahoes there and camped in their teepees. Is so moving, you know. And they're the warriors are there, the men, they still call themselves warriors, you know, and they're riding their horses and they patrol the place. You know, they have the patrols that patrol the camp while it's going on. And and there are very different rituals that take place, and it's a really moving experience. We as I say, we were able to attend several times. The one thing that they do is they bring in a huge lodgepole pine, and they carry this pine in. It's amazing. They drag it in and they bring it down from the mountains, drag it. They use a truck to drag it in, dragging this pine. They set it up, and then before they set it up, it's on the ground, and they have this ritual where the people come and they have calico. They love calico, and they have pieces of calico, and they're called prayer ties, and they tie the calico around around this lodgepole pine. Then when they and it's a prayer, so this is a prayer that they're sending to the Creator, and this is a sign of the prayer. When they put the lodgepole pine up in the center of the Sundance tent or teepee where the dancers actually are, they put the lodgepole pine up. It's in the wind just blows all these prayer, you know, it's just like flags blowing. It's very, very beautiful. So the dancers who participate every year in the Sundance, they prepare for a whole year, and the preparation is really rigorous. They not only have to, they work with elders, they study with the elders. They have to learn all the ritual. They learn all that's behind the ritual, all about their way of life, their spirituality, what they believe, all of that. They have to learn all of that, and they have to prepare physically because they fast and thirst for 3 days. And so they have to prepare for that, to be able to do that physically. And they do it. And then they dance for 3 days. Now they don't dance continuously. They dance and they rest, and they dance and they rest, but they don't eat and they take no liquids. And it's the Sundance is it's a prayer. It's a communal prayer for all the people. So these warriors, these men who offer themselves in this dance every year and go through the whole preparation for a year, and then go through this ordeal, they are doing it as a prayer for all of their people. So it's really meaningful. It's very, very sacred. And when they come out of the Sundance Lodge, they call it, and they're done with the dance and they're given food, they have a juice that they give them, a wild berry juice, and they drink that first, and they sip on that, and then they can take food without getting sick. Who knows? But they learned how to do this many, many, many years ago, and they still do it. It's amazing. So it's a very moving thing. So all these people are camped, all the families come, and all the families are together, all in their teepees all around, and everybody's cooking, and they, you know, it's wonderful. There's all kinds of food. It's a very peaceful and happy time. It's a wonderful time. The Arapahoes are as I said, they're very friendly, but they're very hospitable. So when you go into one of their camps, like at the Sundance, the first thing they say is, you got to eat, and they're pushing food on you. You know, they never would let you leave without eating. You know, that would be insulting. And I think that goes back to the plains, when they lived on the plains. You know, if someone came into their village, they fed them because they'd come from a long distance. They'd come across the plains, and then before they left, you know, or when they left, they were faced with, you know, traveling another great distance. They didn't know when they were going to eat again. So they were always, you know, feeding people. So one time we went up there, And we took part in the sweat lodge, and that's another very, very holy and very difficult. So I was concerned because I mean, I can't even get in a sauna. You know, I have a lot of trouble with that kind of heat. And so I didn't know how I was going to do this sweat lodge, but I was determined I was going to try to do it. And so I did. I went in, and there were 4 rounds. You go into the sweat lodge, which is a teepee, and you go in and you take your seat, and then they have this fire going in the center of the, they call it a lodge, the center of the lodge. And the priest who is managing the sweat lodge, then he will sprinkle, and it's all prayers. They're praying all the time. Everybody's praying and singing, and he'll sprinkle water on the fire, and then he closes the flap of the lodge, and the steam comes out. I tell you, it is hotter than anything I ever experienced in my life. It was, and you're only in there for about 10 minutes, and then you get up and you walk out, but you stay out for just a little while, then you go back in, and there are 4 rounds like that. So I went out the first time, and I said to what do they call them? Well, anyway, he's like the holy man who was conducting the ceremony. I said to him, and I was worried, because I was worried that they would think that if I can't complete the 4 rounds, that it's because I'm not worthy. And I was worried about that, but I knew I couldn't go back in. I thought I was going to die before I got out the first time. And I said to him, I'm sorry, but I can't go back in. He said, it's okay. He said, you sit here outside. And he said, we will still pray for you, and you will still be part of all the prayers. So I spent the rest of the sweat lodge sitting outside while everybody else was in there. I mean, when I got out the first time, we were right by a creek. I literally went and laid down in the creek to cool my body down. I mean, it was just incredible. I don't know how anybody can do it, but it does. It really does. You sweat. It cleans everything. You sweat everything out. And it really, and not only physically, but then and spiritually too. As I say, is a very prayerful time. And then afterwards they have a big feast, and everybody brings food, and so we joined in that. And yeah, it was very, very moving, but boy, it was an experience. So, but I thought, the way they treated me and the way he helped me, and he said, well, you just sit here and we'll still pray for you. And I'll tell you another thing that happened one time. We were going to go to this Sundance Lodge, and we were planning to camp with our friends up there. And I got sick. I just got the flu or something. But anyway, at the last minute, I couldn't go. So we called him and said, we couldn't go. So afterwards, my friend called me, the one we were going to camp with, her family. And she said, I know how I was doing. I said, I was fine. And she said, you will never know how many prayer flags, and that's the strips of calico that they tied around the lodgepole pine. You will never know how many prayer flags were put up for you. So I thought that was really, really touching. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you so much. And I have another question, but if someone else, in the Wind River, you've got the Catholic Church and the Jesuit priests and the mission. And, he does the funerals, but he involves so much of the ceremony. How did that all develop with particularly the Arapaho and the Jesuits?
Yeah, that is actually based on fact. The Jesuits came to the Wind River Reservation about 10 years after the Arapahos were placed there. And the Arapaho leaders, they were familiar with the Jesuits because they had been missionaries out here on the plains. So they knew these priests. And they knew, once they're on the reservation, that their children, as they said, were going to have to follow another road. They were going to have to learn to read English, and they were going to have to learn numbers. and they were going to have to learn how to do things and make things, be carpenters and whatever. And so a group of the leaders decided to go to Omaha, where the Jesuits were. That was the closest where they were. And so they took a train to Omaha and asked the Jesuits to come and teach their children. So that's how they came. And they started a mission there. The actual mission there is called St. Stephen's Mission. And in my book, I call it St. Francis Mission. But it's based on an actual mission that was there. And so they did come and they did teach the kids. And they had a very good school there up until they gave up the school about in the 1970s, I think it was. They just financially they couldn't keep running it, but it was an excellent school. It was all the way. It went from kindergarten through 12th grade, and the people. I mean, we ran into people out there all the time who had graduated from St. Stephen's School. It was a really good school. So, but in the Jesuits are always very open to the Arapaho spirituality and to their way of looking at the world, and so they did really, incorporate a lot of their spiritual things into the Catholic teachings and into this Catholic ceremonies and all. So it's really interesting. If you ever go up there, you can go to St. Stephen's Mission, and the church there is beautiful. It's just beautiful. It's just a little chapel, but it's all painted and decorated by Arapaho artists. And it's all done in their symbols, and the things that mean something to them. It's just an amazing place. I had a reader from Germany contact me one time, and he said he had come over here, and he was over here anyway, so he decided he was going to go to the Wyoming and see the Wind River Reservation because he'd been reading my books. And he did. And he said he thought the church was the most beautiful church he'd ever seen. And he's from Europe, where they have nothing but beautiful churches. So, but it's beautiful. If you ever get a chance to go there, don't miss it.
Thank you.
Okay, Linda,
You have one more?
one more question.
Okay.
One more. I was curious if the Shoshones and the Arapahoes were on the same reservation. Did somebody officiate that there would be peace amongst them? And do the Shoshones participate in the Arapaho services or festivals?
They're absolutely separate. They're absolutely separate. They live on the same reservation, but they are separate. And they get along because they have to, because they own the land together and they own the resources. They do have oil and gas, so they have to deal with that. So, but the Shoshones have their tribal council, the Arapahoes have their tribal council. For a while, they had a combined council, but then they got in a big fight about something, so they broke up. So honestly, right now, I don't know if that's come back together, but they do have to get along because they have to handle issues that have to do with the land and with the resources there, the timber, the water, all these things have to be handled by both of them. So they do have to get along. But, and the kids go to school together and they all know one another, but they don't intermarry. Very rarely do they intermarry. If they do, then they're really ostracized by both groups. I mean, it's really interesting. But they get along to the point where they have to get along. But, they're not friends. And the Shoshones they have their area of the reservation. The Arapahoes have theirs. I got a really sweet email from a Shoshone girl. She was about 14. And she contacted me. She said, well, all you do is write about the Arapahoes. Well, we're on this reservation too. And she said, I would like to invite you to come here for Shoshone Days. They have their celebration in the summer so that you can get to know us, so you can write about us too. And, the reason I do bring them in, I mean, I do make a point of, acknowledging the fact that they are there on the reservation, but I don't know a whole lot about the Shoshones. They're not a tribe that I've researched and really gotten to know as I have the Arapahoes. And so that's why I haven't written a lot about the Shoshones. I've met Shoshone people up there, but I haven't done a lot with them just because I haven't done the research. So, but that was really